included. I don't know. I don't think I can buy panties. I just can't buy panties because I don't know. I don't feel included. Look, I assumed that people that were in wheelchairs also have to buy bras and have to buy underwear. It's just something that I just assumed that was a thing. I didn't know that we needed to see that in our face. I didn't know that now we're going to have to look forward to campaigns where women that are in wheelchairs are now wearing bras and underwear.
Part of being an independent journalist is being able and willing to talk to all sides and hold all sides accountable. In a division-driven society that demands you pick a side, alternative media is usually lumped in as being right-leaning, only because it doesn't carry the water for the left-leaning legacy media. Well, today it's a powerhouse conservative media host on the hot seat. Hear why many think Candace Owens just took her raging commentary too far. Today is Monday, April 17th. I'm Christy Lee, and this is the Counter Narrative. Today's show is all about protecting the innocent and defending those with disabilities. Although I've never really liked that label, in my experience, those with supposed disabilities actually have a lot more abilities than most of us. The ability to embody joy and spread it, the ability to carry a childlike innocence and acceptance of all people and all circumstances, the ability to have unrelenting persistence and determination, the courage to face adversity and struggle, and just embrace their passions. And most of all, the ability to love unconditionally like none other. When I was a local news anchor reporter, I used to beg to cover Tim Tebow's Night to Shine. You saw some of those pictures just a little bit ago. I begged to cover that each year. It's a prom for those with special needs. Covering news daily in a fast-paced, deadline-driven leads culture could of course be depressing. Being surrounded by those with special needs, dancing, smiling, singing, hugging, loving was my day of healing. At this prom each year, there were no cliques, there were no inhibitions, just everyone embracing a good time together. And in a God wink kind of a way, through my job as a news anchor, I actually met an adorable little girl with Down syndrome who later became my goddaughter. You saw a recent picture of us there on FaceTime. So in other words, anyone with anything derogatory to say about anyone disabled is not going to be on my good side. I don't care who you are. Now, let me preface this by saying I think Candace Owens is an extremely intelligent and usually extremely well-spoken. She's excellent at defending her positions and research, and that is why this little tirade that she went on is so disappointing. Check it out.
Why did they do this? I don't know. I don't know why this needed to be done. I'm just getting tired of this all inclusivity thing. It seems ridiculous. I mean, we're going to be on crutches and be like, well, how come we don't have a girl that's broken her leg on crutches also in a bra and underwear? I don't feel included. I don't know. I don't think I can buy panties. I just can't buy panties because I don't know. I don't feel included. Look, I assumed that people that were in wheelchairs also have to buy bras and have to buy underwear. It's just something that I just assumed that was a thing. I didn't know that we needed to see that in our face. I didn't know that now we're going to have to look forward to campaigns where women that are in wheelchairs are now wearing bras and underwears. When I see stuff like this, I just go, whose idea was this? Was it your idea? Okay, you're fired. I'd like to fire the person who was behind this ridiculous campaign.
Now, this is the kind of thing that makes those of us countering the approved narrative look bad. They love to label anyone not towing the line as a grifter, which is hilarious because if I'm a grifter, I'm definitely not doing it right. I've only lost money since giving up my career in the corporate news world. But if there is grifting, that rant by Candace Owens sure seems like it to me. There is plenty to be alarmed about right now, plenty to be outraged about. Yes, the powers that be are pushing inclusivity so far that they're actually excluding real women in favor of men because of stereotypes. But this isn't it. Not even close to the same thing. Going on an angry rant because that's your shtick, that's what'll get you the clicks. This is the kind of feigned over the top outrage I despise, and many conservative media babes and bros. It's sensationalism at its best. So that now makes you no better than what traditional journalism has become with the sensationalism. So here's what Candace has issue with: a model showing uh, from Kim Kardashian's Skim line this underwear and bra. I think we might have a picture of that. Here it is. It's says it's a signature buttery soft and stretchy brief with hook and eye closures at each side for adding accessibility of dressing. Discreet bonding at closure lays flat against the body for an invisible look and feel under the clothing. So many are disappointed in Candace. She's faced a lot of backlash on social media that this underwear that is actually useful, makes life easier for the disabled, that she would mock it. And it's not just backlash from folks that would hate her anyway because she dares to be a conservative Black woman. One lifelong conservative woman even wrote Candace Owens an open letter published in USA Today. She says, "Women like me who use wheelchairs can and should model underwear." The author, Melissa Ortiz, is working on behalf of Americans with disabilities. She said she has admired Candace as a conservative contributor, but is very disappointed, obviously, with this recent rant. Now, we were going to talk with Melissa Ortiz today, but an emergency came up right before the show. So we're praying for her, and we're just going to go ahead and bring in my next interview who is familiar with the video. But first, I want to show you what happened after the backlash. Let's watch the response from Candace after that backlash.
Watch.
I don't know. And if I'm wrong, again, educate me. Today, I just want to be educated in the comments. If people that are in wheelchairs were thinking as they were looking around, like, you know what really upsets me? That I've never seen a bra and underwear advertised with a girl in a wheelchair. And by the way, I think people in wheelchairs will back me up on this. I think they're on my side. I think they think this is stupid.
Oops, I did it again, people, and not in a good way. Landed myself in some hot water yesterday. Very surprised. Suddenly, I was being tagged by a ton of people that were in wheelchairs, and there's no other way to say it other than they want to whip my ass. I need your help.
Now, to weigh in on this topic of disability inclusion is Mark Davis Pickup. Mark is an award-winning writer and speaker. He's had articles published in the National Post newspaper in Canada, Human Life Review in New York, and multiple others. His Christian blog, humanlifematters.org, has more than 1 million page views from across North America. Mark has worked for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation as both television writer and radio current affairs writer. He wrote and narrated a television documentary and has been featured in other documentaries. He's spoken across North America warning against accepting euthanasia and assisted suicide. And of course, he's advocating for disability issues, having himself suffered through sudden onset paralysis from multiple sclerosis for years before miraculously walking again kind of recently. It is a joy to interview you again, Mark Davis Pickup. Thank you so much for joining me. Now, I know that you did get to see Candace Owens' rant about women in wheelchairs modeling underwear. So I wanted to hear your first impression on that.
Well, I've always liked Candace Owens. I think she went way too far on this particular broadcast. I don't know why she would do that. She lost me as a fan. I don't understand why she would have done that. Um, there was a time, and it's in my lifetime. I remember when there were very few Black broadcasters. I remember when there were very few women newscasters. That had to change, and that changed um, largely in attitudes being changed by people seeing Black broadcasters, female anchors, female reporters. Um, and that image of, we talk about exclusivity and inclusivity. There was this view at that time that someone like Candace would probably not have been on a current affairs show or a newscast. And I honestly don't understand why she would now be doing that to disabled.
Now, she says she acted disgusted, and she said she didn't want to see models in underwear and wheelchairs. What do you make of that? I mean, how far should inclusivity go? I understand like where she's coming from and the frustration with like, oh, we need to have trans representation in absolutely everything and base things off of sexual preference, but this is so much different. This is something that people live with and they they deserve to be treated just like anyone else. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's taking an argument to its absurd conclusion. People with disabilities are in a different category to the trans group. Their disabilities were imposed upon them. This is people with disabilities have been excluded for centuries from society. We don't improve that by keeping them behind the scenes. Of course, coming from the disability community, I don't find anything offensive in that. What the fashion show that she was looking at. In fact, I'd like to see people, in this case, women with disabilities in the fashion industry, just as I would like to see women with disabilities, people with disabilities in the broadcasting industry. If we don't have people to present a visual image to us, then the next generation coming up won't have a model to work on, to work with, to in fact consider things like the fashion industry or television or film. It's by showing that we move ahead, not by hiding it.
Yeah, she called the advertisement a ridiculous campaign and she would fire the person who came up with such an idea. What do you make of that?
Well, I would say what made it ridiculous. People with disabilities represent almost 20% of the population. They're a significant group. Now, of course, advertisers may say, yeah, but the people with disabilities tend to be poor. They tend to live in poverty. And that's true. Large swaths of the disabled do live in poverty. So they're not great consumers. That brings us to the next question. Why? If any other portion of the population had the rates of unemployment and poverty that people with disabilities have in the United States and Canada, it would be a national scandal. She finds this ridiculous. What's ridiculous about it? I don't see it.
Why do you think people with visible disabilities should be seen in different lines of work and professions? I know you kind of touched on this before, but you even have your own personal story about trying to get people in these positions and facing resistance in your own experience.
Well, in my short career, I worked with Canadian Civil Service in the area of trying to improve job prospects for people with disabilities. And we worked under an Employment Equity Act, which tried to get a workforce that somewhat resembled the population. And of course, those groups like the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which gets over $1 billion a year on public money, was expected to try and meet targets. Now, that's another word for quotas, and I don't like that idea either. But I was working within the program, so I had to try and coax them to at least consider people with disabilities in their organization. They resisted. The more I approached them, the more resistant they got. I happened to be friends with a regional director of human resources who was in favor of what I was trying to do. And so he took me into the organization. I asked for a secondment from the department that I was with into the CBC to take any job in any role other than janitorial, because that's where they would, if they were going to hire people, always be at the bottom of the scale. And so they got me on as a researcher, writer for a radio program. And I wanted to illustrate to them that a person with a disability has something to contribute to a program, to the normal operations of a program, in this case, a radio current affairs program. And so for almost a year, I did that with them. I got glowing reviews. And when it was time to end my secondment, I met with the senior management covering television and radio for the CBC, and tried to get them to consider hiring people with disabilities, using myself as an example. At one point during our interview, I mentioned broadcasters, anchors, and reporters with people with visible disabilities, and that's not to exclude people with invisible disabilities, but I was specifically referring to visible disabilities because, like I said before, to give a role model for young people with disabilities coming up to consider broadcasting. And the response I got from a very senior member of the CBC was, well, I suppose we could put a table in front of them and cover up their wheelchair. My response was, well, how do you know it's going to be a wheelchair? And secondly, even if it was, why would you want to hide the wheelchair? That's part of the person's identity. It's part of who they are. To which he slammed his file on the table and swore and walked out. But that was the kind of resistance. They could not see a person with a disability in front of a camera. And I reminded them that there was a time when it was very rare that you would see women in roles of broadcasters, news anchors, news reporters. And now, because of that exposure and that fight that women gave to getting women into those positions that were traditionally male, it's common. We see about half of the on-air staff across the spectrum of broadcasting are female. In fact, most news programs will have a man and a woman now. That was not always the case. And so I was trying to present that as an example of how we can approach bringing qualified people with disabilities into the broadcasting industry. And if we're talking inclusion, I think that goes a long way to promote that.
Now, you are obviously for inclusion, but your own country, Canada, where you're at, euthanizes suicidal or disabled people. What are your views on what Canada calls medical assistance in dying, that MAID program for disabled people?
Yeah, we're euthanizing disabled people by the thousands. Canada's, I mean, this is something of deep shame for me as a Canadian. We legalized what they called medical assistance in dying in 2016. And that was it. The criteria was you had to have a reasonably foreseeable death, whatever that means. And the first year there was about 10,000 people euthanized. We've got over 30,000 people that have been euthanized. But in 2021, they removed the criteria of having to have a reasonably foreseeable death, which turned the sights on the disabled community that were suicidal. And why wouldn't they be suicidal? We have unprecedented rates of poverty. We have, everybody talks glowingly about Canada's social network. It isn't that good. In fact, it's very poor. Without having the proper access to medical care and psychiatric care, decent housing, decent transportation, loneliness, people will become defeated. They'll choose to die. But that isn't a free and autonomous choice. That's being driven to that point. And the disabled community understood that and protested to the federal government, which didn't listen. They were bent on legalizing euthanasia under this euphemism, this syrupy, sweet euphemism, medical assistance in dying, which really was lethal injection. Very few, a tiny, minuscule number of people chose to have self-administered suicide with the doctor's help. Virtually all of the people who have been, of the 30,000 people who've been euthanized, have had a lethal injection. And the disabled community saw this as a direct attack on the disability community, and it is. But the Liberal government doesn't have the courage to come out and say that. Then we went one step further. You see, you have to introduce evil in increments. There was a time when the idea of assisting someone in their suicide was absolutely unthinkable, and it wasn't that many generations ago. But the Liberal government then introduced the idea of euthanizing the mentally ill, and they were going to have that criteria introduced into the equation this past March. But there was such an outcry from the psychiatric community, from the disability community, from community groups in general, that the Justice Minister, a man by the date, doesn't I wasn't mention his name, or you could look it up. Our Justice Minister backed off and moved the implementation date for assisting the suicides of the mentally ill till March of 2024, next year. It's going to happen. They're not going to change, and this is their agenda. They didn't tell us that. We kind of half knew it, but that's where we're at. And
I mean,
you talk
we're
about
already talking about signing bills, I think in Washington State, to allow children without parental knowledge or consent to essentially mutilate themselves for gender affirming care.
yeah.
When you implement this thing in Canada about allowing essentially medically assisted suicide, I mean, if we're already saying apparently kids can decide to change their gender before 18, like how far are we from allowing a depressed junior hire to, without parental knowledge or consent, go and try and get medically assisted suicide?
Oh, you would say that. There was a parliamentary committee that released their report this year recommending that very thing, that as they call them mature minors, the rest of us call them children, who are terminally ill, to request euthanasia without their parents' consent. That was a recommendation of a parliamentary committee who also recommended those other things that have already been implemented. So my question then becomes, so how long is it going to be before we're euthanizing our dying children? And then from there, until we euthanize our disabled children, the same as is happening now to adults. This is the slippery slope. And I know that the liberal, progressive, woke community laughs at the slippery slope, but we've seen it in so many things, and this is just one of them. If Canada can serve any purpose for the United States, it can serve the purpose of where not to go, what not to do. Don't use us as an example. We've abandoned being a civil society long ago.
And it seems embraced this whole concept of eugenics, essentially, right?
It is. And I'll share something with you, Christy. I have a daughter. They're talking now about euthanizing the mentally, as they call them, challenged, mentally ill. I have a daughter who's autistic, a grandson who's autistic, nieces who are bipolar. Mental illness runs in our family. And of course, I have a physical disability. And I really do wonder when my family and families like ours will be culled from the population. This is a whole dark, brave new world that we've entered under the guise of autonomy. It's an intolerance of, if not hatred, of a vulnerable community. It costs too much to keep around. In fact, it was interesting to note that when the law first passed in 2016, some economists from one of the universities in Canada wrote a paper on how much money they could save through euthanizing the dying, the sick, and the disabled. And they were coming up with hundreds of millions of dollars every year because we have universal health care. And, you know, there's an old saying is if someone says it's not about the money, it's about the money.
Absolutely.
You wonder how much incentive.
Right. Now, you have spoken across Canada and the US about disability inclusion and living a life with dignity. So how do you envision that happening?
I envision that happening almost in spite of the federal and state or provincial, excuse me, provincial governments. It happens at the community level. Yes, with help from governments where needed, but it happens at the community level, and it happens through things such as the very thing that Candace poo-pooed, through including people with disabilities in our communities and providing them with the barrier-free environments that will help them be part of a community. Things as simple as curb cuts. When a new neighborhood is being put in, rather than having curb cuts that are square off the edge, just have them a gentle slope so wheelchairs can get on and off them. Make buildings that are accessible. Convert old ones. Those are small physical things, but the real barriers that I discovered through decades of in a wheelchair were not the physical barriers. The real barriers are in the mind, and that's where we begin to change, to introduce a new philosophy. Actually, it's an old philosophy, that we answer the ancient question, am I my brother's keeper? We can answer like Cain answered, no. Or we can say yes. And I believe in the goodness of people. And I think that when the question is asked, we choose the answer yes. We choose to have connection with all the members in our human community in it. That if we can do that, we do it. And we do that through education. We do that through exposure. We do that through reaching out to each other. And that must include the vulnerable, whether that be children in the womb or out of the womb, or the disabled, or the old, or the homeless. Any society that claims to be civilized understands that and takes care of the vulnerable first, and takes whatever steps they can to include people rather than exclude people. And the community that I represent, or I'm a member of, the disabled, have gone throughout history excluded. We can change that, and it comes through education. It comes through changing physical infrastructure in communities, and providing aids to children and adults who need them, making minor accommodations in the workplace. And they can be as minor as raising a desk so a wheelchair can get underneath it, making a bathroom stall that will accommodate a wheelchair, making alarms so that they are visual, so that if there's a fire, that the lights are flashing, so that people with hearing impairment or deafness can benefit from that. Those are the things I think that we do and begin to introduce the ideal of including people with disabilities, including people of color, including our native populations in Canada, particularly. It's an issue now. That is where we need to go, and including our children, all of them, from womb to birth and after birth. Do what it takes to make them rise to their full potential. Mm-hmm. That applies to everybody else too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mark, I have to hit a break and hear from our sponsors, but I want to remind our audience that you can check out Mark's blog, humanlifematters.org. He's also available to speak to community groups or churches about life issues, disability issues, grief, and self-image. So thank you again so much, Mark. I'm sure we'll have you on again as we continue to deal with these culture wars and this agenda to save money by euthanizing people. Thank you again.
Always good to talk to you. Always.